Let's dive into this one. This one I'm really, really passionate about. All right, so we got some fun material to go through today. It's a topic actually that was at the kind of center of research I did for my MBA back at California Lutheran University in my former hometown of Thousand Oaks, California. Beautiful place. CLU is a really great school. I got my MBA there, actually, thanks to Kevin, I think, and Medtronic. They were good enough to help me in my career by sponsoring that MBA that I got. And so I did some research on this idea of sort of team-based decision-making using analytics and intuition as a combined force. But I wanted to start just by talking a little bit here, and hopefully you all can see my screen. So in webinar number 5, I am covering the role of human intuition in analytics. And I want to talk today about how important it is that we apply the way that we see the world to anytime we interact with data, and even before we do that, as well as on the back end when we actually implement a decision, make a presentation. Interwoven through this entire process that we've covered in earlier webinars is this important element of human intuition. So let's talk about it. Where did this come from? Oh, before I go any further, a sincere thank you to all of you for joining. This series is all about speaking about the language of data, and sometimes we cover very technical things. Like last week, we were focusing on how to explore the contours of your data. So that really got into some technical aspects, like looking for nulls. And this week is a little bit more on the theoretical side of things, where we talk about some almost philosophical component of working with data. But I want to make sure this topic doesn't become too theoretical. I think it's a very practical topic. It gets to how we as individuals, leaders, team members, use data to make decisions. So, this is what we do week in and week out, sometimes individually, sometimes as teams, most often in large corporations and organizations as teams. And so, it isn't just ideas that are nice to think about. This is really getting to the nuts and bolts of how we actually go about making decisions and using data. I think that's a big part of being data literate, is knowing how to use data and combine it with other things that we have at our disposal, like human intuition, to arrive at the best decision. So it started off with a thought that a commercial. I saw a commercial actually on TV. And the quote in the commercial, this is going back a few years, there was sort of an individual in a case study mentioned, and the person on TV said, "We used to use intuition, now we use analytics." And this was a business intelligence software company. I don't think it really matters who it is, because someone who's been in that industry for some time now, I saw this attitude pervaded by many, many different vendors of software, people in the BI industry, sort of coming to this sort of notion that we are replacing this flawed gut that we have with now like data that's sort of steering us in the right direction. So this is this dichotomy that was positioned for us. Like on the one hand, there's gut and instinct and intuition. On the other hand, there's data. And so, we're replacing one with the other, or that's the way this commercial wanted us to think about it. So I had a very visceral reaction to that negatively, and I want to talk about why. But before we go into why, let's ask some basic questions, right? So what do we mean by analytics? So this is from the book Competing on Analytics, The New Science of Winning, by Thomas Davenport and Gene Harris. And they say analytics, what's meant by analytics, the extensive use of data, statistical and quantitative analysis, explanatory and predictive models, and fact-based management to drive decisions and actions. That's what analytics is, okay? Makes sense, right? If you have a different understanding of that term, feel free to put it in the chat, but I think it's pretty straightforward. We're becoming familiar with this term now. And I mean, I guess it's fair then that we would also ask the question, what does intuition mean? The literal dictionary definition for intuition is the ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning. And it comes from this Latin word intuere, which is about looking at something or gazing upon something, okay? So that's the definition of intuition, this sort of sense we have about a path we should take or not take, what is right, what is wrong, what needs to happen, what needs to be avoided. and those types of things. These are these kind of human intuitions we have. Sometimes we don't even know where they come from. So how is a team supposed to, decide what to do? How do we use these factors? So intuition, if we look at it a little more, right? I've used these words already here in the webinar, but synonyms for intuition include hunch, instinct, and oftentimes the phrase we hear, gut. And again, it's very much spoken of negatively in many contexts, within business nowadays, I would say. And there's a reason for that. So from the book Super Crunchers, which is going back a few years now, Yale economist Ian Ayres talks about this thing happening in our environment today. You and I, people we're working with, are faced with, according to Mr. Ayres, this interesting development. He says we're in a historic moment of horse versus locomotive competition, where intuitive and experiential expertise, on the one hand, is losing out time and time again to number crunching. He goes on, he says, data-based decision-making is on the rise all around us. Very true. We see people talk about this. And then he issues the warning, intuitivists beware. Okay, so he paints this picture of this, horse versus locomotive, this man versus machine, this sort of, it's a dichotomy that's being positioned, right? That there's one way of doing things that involves our gut, one way of doing things that involves data, as I'm sure you kind of have followed throughout the course of the webinar today. I'm just sort of, positioning this debate right now. And this is exactly what we see all around us, is this is how it is framed. And framing is super important. But, on the one hand, we can say, well, I understand, many may have read Moneyball, where we hear the story of the baseball scouts, right? Those ones that drive from village to village, town to town across middle America, taking notes and scratch pads, and they have their feel for this baseball player and how just many skills he has and things like that, based on their trained eye watching them play the sport, as opposed to these more sort of math nerds crunching numbers on their historical stats, coming up with a prediction for who should be drafted. In Moneyball, that was the case of the Oakland A's, and Billy Beane bringing a data-driven approach to deciding who to bring onto their team from the minor leagues. So this is, again, this positioning of the old sort of seasoned scout, doesn't really like numbers or math or computers. This young sort of Ivy League, maybe economist or math nerd sitting in a room somewhere crunching numbers, couldn't even pick up a bat, let alone swing it. And, this is kind of the two worlds that we're seeing. Right. Well, and again, I can understand the backlash or the animosity towards this idea of using intuition, especially in teams, because, well, let's say we're on the same team. What if my intuition is different than yours? Do you just outrank me? Do I outrank you? How do we deal with that kind of a conflict? And as we've become more and more aware over the past few decades, the number of ways in which our gut can lead us astray is dizzying. Look at this slide right here. It's a beautiful slide that shows just a graphical layout of all of these cognitive biases. So you can go around the circle here, and these are all ways in which our mind can trick us or lead us astray. Just as an aside, I'll just kind of switch over here quickly to the browser. There's a great list of these on Wikipedia. Let me just see if I can pull that up here. Yeah, a list of cognitive biases, right? So biases, we can go down the list here, right? So we have the ambiguity effect, where you tend to avoid options for which the probability of a favorable outcome is unknown. Or, the anchoring effect, where you rely too heavily or anchor on one trait or piece of information when making a decision. And we can go down the list here, right? This availability heuristic. We're going to talk about that one. What's that one? Well, the availability heuristic is simply the mental shortcut, that relies on immediate examples that come to mind when we're making some evaluation. So I can think immediately of certain things, right? Therefore, those things are available in my mind. I'm much more likely to use them. And so, under this heuristic, people tend to heavily weigh their judgments toward more recent information, right? So now I have new opinions, and they're based on the latest news that I just came in, And this piece of new information that comes in the door is used much more heavily and given more weight and importance in our overall decision than perhaps others that are more important that may not be as readily sort of come to mind. So these are ways again, in which our intuition can lead us astray. And using these things when we're making decisions can seem very problematic. But on the other hand, let's not just trash intuition. I mean, yes, there is a difficult and challenging and even problematic side to it, but it's also a very powerful tool. So for example, if you walk into the room and you see people that are there and you're going to interact with them, you have an intuition about their mood. You have an intuition about aspects of their personality, at least in that moment of time, that you may not even really be able to articulate. It just sort of occurs to you. Here I am in this room, and there's a person who is happy or excited or sad. So this is based on things we see, facial features, and ways they use their face and their muscles in their face to express or convey certain kinds of emotions. So this isn't something we process in a rational or intellectual way. This sort of is something that we just immediately know. We have intuition about it. So there's some value there. And it isn't just about emotions and interpersonal, which is a huge intuition component, but also actually the way we process data itself can have this intuitive component. Just research the term preattentive processing. What that's all about is the fact that everyone is going to see and notice certain things about the way data is visualized, whether they try or not. For example, if I show this slide to anyone of any age, of any background, they're going to notice things. Like in the top left, they'll notice if one of the little slits there, the little lines is tilted. Okay, they'll notice if they're more dense than others, or if one's curved. These kind of maybe one's thicker than others, like in the top right. Whether one's closed or open. So take a look at every one of these. There are things that pop off the screen to you. You don't have to go through a checklist or sit down and analyze it. That would be silly because you just see these differences. It's like it happens to you in a very intuitive way. So even processing data, there's an intuitive component to that. So intuition then isn't just a horrible thing. I mean, yes, it's true that we can go around the corner and recoil back from a coiled garden hose and think that it's a snake. And as this book I love, you may not have heard of, called On Being Certain by Dr. Robert Burton, he says the reflexive jumping back at the sight of a coiled black object, we do that sometimes. We just instinctively fear what's in front of us. Okay, that's a split-second judgment, and sometimes it's correct, and we save our lives, right? This object is a snake. Sometimes it isn't. The object is a curled up garden hose. So just because we develop a split-second decision making to enhance survival doesn't guarantee that these decisions are always correct. Okay, so that's part of the problem with intuition, as we've talked about, is this knee-jerk reaction. Sometimes it's dead on and so important. Sometimes it's, completely wrong. Okay, so we've got this interesting thing to sort of try to wrestle with or decide how we're going to process. You've heard this phrase, let's summarize, right? So there's an image that comes from this phrase, data is the new oil. It's sometimes attributed to Clive Humby, who Clive was as I understand it from a quick cursory research of this phrase, and Clive, he is like a data scientist. He did some pretty seminal work with Tesco, the grocery store chain in the UK, as you know. And this was something that he said, I think in the early 2000s, data is the new oil. So there's this sort of idea that this is this resource that companies can use, a very rich resource. Sometimes it's in a raw form, like oil you're pulling from the ground. Sometimes it's in more refined form, like in gasoline. So this is the image of using data as a resource to drive decisions, to steer the company in a certain way. So I'd like to kind of stick with that whole analogy and say, well, if we take this internal combustion engine, right, this idea that in order to get from point A to point B, we need to use gas and we need to convert it into energy and motion in the form of an internal combustion engine in an automobile. And so, in that scenario, my analogy and the way I would bring intuition into that analogy is to say that if data is the new oil, then intuition is the spark plug. Okay, so if we imagine a stroke engine here. It intakes gas, and then you have a compression cycle. You have the spark plug igniting the compressed gas, which then powers the piston down. And then you have your exhaust cycle. Okay, so what's that spark? That spark is the thing that actually takes the compressed gas, ignites it, and causes there to be this reaction, this producing of energy, conversion of energy in one form to another, but conversion into motion. So our intuition is our spark plug, and I want to be able to kind of really use that image as a way to focus in on the value of intuition and how we make use of it. So in the past, in the last few webinars, we've laid out this decision-making, data working flow. And so I don't expect you to take it all in right now, but suffice it to say, if you go back to the second and third webinars, we spent a lot of time talking about how you can take data, and as someone who's new to working with data, who's just going through the motion and figuring out these steps, you can go through a process of converting a question about the world into a decision where to go. So this would be then this whole analogy of the car moving. Okay, the car is moving and it's using data as gas. But I want to show on laying over on top of this flow chart exactly where I believe those intuitive components are found. And then we'll look through kind of all about them. So I feel strongly that there are 5 different ways in which human intuition, that spark plug, can be used as we seek to convert data to decisions. And notice that it's sort of laid out almost like a journalistic sort of a interview, okay? Why, what, where, when, who, and how. And intuition is involved in every single one of those 6 components. Let's dive into them one by one. So knowing why any of it matters in the first place. Think about it. You're in a business, you're running that business. You're looking at data. Why? Why are you looking at that data? What do you care about? What are you hoping to accomplish? What's your organization's mission, and why do you think that's a valuable thing to do in the world? Why do you think that could be a profitable enterprise? Breaking it down into even smaller pieces. Why are you looking at a product and launching that kind of product? What is it about it? There's intuition involved in that whole process. Knowing why the endeavor we are taking upon ourselves is important or valuable at all is, to me, an intuitive component. In fact, Albert Einstein says the only real valuable thing is intuition. How remarkable a statement. Not only is human intuition not useless or dangerous or anything, in some ways, if you stop and think about it, it's actually the only thing that matters at all. Because whether we make a decision based on intuition or analytics, ultimately it's our intuition about why we're doing it in the first place that actually matters. So in that sense, you can see the spark plug at the very beginning of this 4-stroke engine, okay, of analytics and data working flow. So in the top left-hand corner, you're making an observation about your environment. You're making an observation about the customers you'd like to delight, the competition you are perhaps looking to beat out. You're observing something about the trend of what's happening in the moment. And then from there, this whole idea, the key word here, right, is ask a worthwhile question. Others have reached out to me and said, Ben, I like it, but I would change that to a meaningful question. I like it. I think that in that sense, I would use either one here, but ultimately, what is it that imbues that question with value, meaningfulness, worthwhileness, what have you? And that is the human aspect of what we're doing. And we have an intuitive understanding of that based on our intuition, right? So that's the first one. Why are we doing any of this? Number 2, I think this is an important one, right? So there's actually an intuitive component of working with data. We've already shown preattentive traits and how we sense when we visualize data, what's happening. We notice patterns or trends, interesting things pop off the screen, and we say, I wonder what that means, right? So that process of wondering, of being inquisitive, there's an intuitive component to that. Knowing what the data is telling us, and importantly, what it's not telling us. So, for example, I love this kind of, when we published the 17 key traits of data literacy, the first aspect, the first component is all about knowledge of data literacy. This was covered in the very first webinar. And Alberto Cairo, who gave the quote for the knowledge section, who's University of Miami Knight Chair and author of a couple very good books, The Functional Art and The Truthful Art. So Alberto, a friend of mine, says, working with data, so it isn't just about what matters or why it matters, number one. Number two, even working with data has an intuitive component, right? So it requires a certain degree, according to Alberto, of numerical and graphical literacy, respectively, called numeracy and graphicacy. Numeracy isn't just mathematics, statistics, or logic, right? There's that reasoning side, but it's a sixth sense, he uses the term, a sixth sense that is grounded on a grasp, even a tenuous one, of fundamental concepts of those areas. We sort of get a sense as we get better and better at working with data about what the numbers mean. What do they mean? You know, what's the actual meaning of the numbers themselves? Graphicacy, this is the visual component, on the other hand, consists of developing intuitions. He uses the I word right there, right? Developing intuitions of what kinds of graphs, charts, or maps are more adequate to either explore the data ourselves or, as we're talking about in a moment, communicate the main insights we've obtained to other people. So intuitions, that's an important concept. It actually is connected to how we visualize data. What does it mean to us? How can we interpret it? As well as then next step down the road, how do we convey this to someone in a meaningful way that's going to be informative to them, that's going to be something they can grasp? Laurie says, in academic research on intuition, what is agreed upon is that intuition is an experience-based process, resulting in a spontaneous tendency toward a hunch or a hypothesis. Great quote. Thanks, Laurie. So, you know, even kind of the number two part of it is, what is the data telling us? This is something that actually we need to have an intuitive sense about as we work with data, knowing what graph types are going to work, both for our own understanding and for others, as well as, you know, what's the actual significance or meaning of the numbers that we're diving into. Okay, so where would you see that? Well, so that would be over here in the discover phase, where you're starting to analyze the data, okay, see what it's saying and not saying right there. Also determining both the practical and the statistical significance. So, you know, does it matter to you that attrition is going up or down? If so, why? Is that an important thing for you to consider or not? If so, why? If not, why not? So those are things that we need to have an intuitive sense about. And not just the practical significance, why does this matter to us in a business, but the statistical significance as well. Sometimes you see something and you kind of ask yourself, is this a significant trend? Is that outlier, you know, kind of something I should be concerned about, or is it small sample sizes? The more and more you work with data, the more you get an intuitive sense for what potential pitfalls could be involved with the way you're looking at it or working with it. All right, so actual working with data, the human act of interacting with data is something where we bring our intuition to the table. I think this is really important because, you know, I believe there are a lot of people out there, and the reason I started my business is because they feel intimidated by data, like somehow they need to check all of their experience at the door and it's no longer useful. And now they need to instead do what the data tells them. And that's just simply not the case. You know, they need to bring their intuition and experience. They need to bring that. In fact, it's required that they use those very skills that they have when they actually interact with the data itself too. That's number two. Number three, I love this next one. So knowing where to look next. So the quote for this one comes from Jonas Salk, as you may know, often credited with discovering the polio vaccine in the mid-20th century, Jonas Salk. And so what he says is that intuition will tell the thinking mind where to look next. So this is the where component, right? So sometimes we get knee-deep into some data, but all of a sudden we stop and we say, wait a second, I'm missing the boat here. I need to look at something a little different. Case in point, use an ongoing example right now about this Boeing 737 aircraft that has tragically had a couple of accidents here in the past 5 or 6 months. So what we're seeing right now is people saying, well, pilots were complaining about that in federal records. Okay, fair enough. But then you have an intuition that says, well, wait a second. I've seen this kind of thing before. Are they also complaining about other airplanes that haven't crashed? What's the ratio? What's the rate of complaints compared to the usage of those jets, right? So it's a deeper question. And there's a gut intuition that tells you to go there. And beyond just perhaps the first layer or level of analysis, and to say, hold on, I need to look at this from a different angle now. There's actually a deeper question that actually may be more important than the first one. So where do we see that? Would be this flow has these kind of like jump off or exit points up to the top. You notice? So sometimes you get into this in the seek column number 2 there, where you're exploring data. You're not maybe necessarily conducting analysis. You're just sort of seeing what's there. And as you go through the process of seeing what's there, oh, I noticed there's a variable or an attribute. Maybe it's a column in a spreadsheet. Maybe it's a characteristic or an attribute of a record in a database. And you say, oh, I didn't even know that element would have been there. I didn't really think about that ahead of time. Here I am exploring and seeing what this data has in it. And that prompts a whole new question that I have. And that leads down a different avenue now. And we go back to the top and make a different observation and maybe ask an even more worthwhile question. So that idea that came to you and me as we were starting to kind of orient ourselves on what's included in the data is intuition. It's saying, whoa, time out. I should think about that. I should look at that. As well as when we're in the analysis phase itself, and we start to realize maybe down the road as we conduct our analysis that there's a deeper analysis there as well. So there's another jump off point to the top where you find another question, right? That discovery of another question sometimes happens to you. You will say, well, I didn't go down a checklist to say, here are the other kinds of questions I should be thinking about, or let me look at this sort of framework to sort of assess all of the potential. You just sort of had it. It happened to you. It was this like a garden hose, right? You're like, whoa, oh my gosh, I should think about that. That's intuition. Okay, let's move on. So that's 3. And we're kind of cruising here. So this is good. We're making good time. Number 4, knowing when to stop looking and take action. So we're on the when now. So we can analyze data all day long, as you all know. You've all heard the phrase analysis paralysis. In fact, there's a very interesting story, you may have heard about it, of a neuroscientist at UCLA. His name is Antonio Damasio. I think he wrote a book called Descartes Error, I believe is the name of it. Now, he has this famous patient named Elliot, and that's not his real name. It's just the name that he assigned to this patient, who had an injury to his frontal lobe. Now, this patient became paralyzed, decision-making wise. In other words, was perfectly well adjusted and kind of successful individual prior to the injury to his frontal lobe. After, though, became crippled with decisions. In other words, let's say, for example, he spent an entire day at work trying to determine how to sort his files. Should it be by, the date of the file? Should it be by the relevance to a certain project? Should it be by the size of the file? And he would literally get stuck in this loop of trying to figure out and analyze and assess the pros and cons of every possible way to organize his file. Tragic, right? I mean, it really did destroy this person's life. When you would ask this individual, as I believe Dr. Damasio did, which restaurant to go to, things like that, they would say, well, I noticed that there weren't many people at that restaurant, so, that could be a really bad thing. Maybe the food's not good. But on the other hand, well, there's a good chance that we're going to get a C. And so they would just kind of endlessly loop and go through these different evaluations. And it's an extreme case, of course, but we've learned a lot from those extreme cases and neuroscientists that have done analyses of individuals with these extreme cases. And so, he would never then have that leap off point to say, I'm just going to make a call. I'm going to go to the restaurant or not, right? And because that's almost an emotional thing. That's almost an emotional thing where we kind of say, I have to make a decision now. The time has come for me to make the call. And so this is a fascinating case of an individual here that we've seen and that has been archived or studied extensively. So at some point in time, we need to stop and make a call. So in some instances or contexts, that can be actually very quick. And so where would we see that on our flow chart? Well, we would see it in these question mark points, right? The diamond or the diamond shaped decision boxes there within the decision tree are questions that we ask ourselves, and then we make a decision one way or another, right? So did you answer your question? You did all this analysis, did it answer your question? You had a question, right? Well, do you have a satisfactory answer? Yes or no? Yeah, you could go down more nuances if you like, ad nauseum, or you can say, what I have is good enough. Also, then after a presentation is given, is it time to make a decision? Is it time to enact a change? Is it time to put something in motion? Yes or no? And that's sort of this point at which human intuition says, there's a diminishing the law of returns here, right? Where we can do more analysis, but actually, not only is it not going to incrementally add value, it actually might catastrophically cause failure because it might be too late. It might be too late. So I love this quote by Gary Kasparov. He wrote a book I highly recommend called How Life Imitates Chess. As you may know, Gary Kasparov, Russian chess champion, pretty much all through my childhood growing up, just on top of the chess world for a very long time. And he says, something has to tell you when the law of diminishing returns is kicking in. And that something is intuition. What's interesting is this quote came from some analysis he did that chess grandmasters, when they would analyze their games, they would actually make more mistakes in the analysis of the game after the fact than they would during the heat of the game itself, when they're under pressure with a clock and they need to move. So he came out of that analysis with the following key takeaway. The things we usually think of as advantages, having more time to think and analyze, having more information at our disposal, can short circuit what matters even more, our intuition. So he talked about there being some cases in business where, and in fact, he goes on to articulate in this exact same chapter here that for scenarios where you need to make quick decisions, intuition is even more important than business decisions in which you have the luxury of time and relevant information to bring to bear to make that decision. So that's also a component that we need to have an intuitive feel for. Is this a climate where we have to decide quick and move because time is of the essence? Or is this an environment and a scenario in which we need to take our time and really look at it from multiple angles? If we feel for a moment that this is a decision-making scenario in which time is of the essence, and if we wait, we lose a window of opportunity to take advantage of an opportunity or something like that, then intuition becomes even more and more important, as he talked about in this chapter. That's number 4. Okay, so knowing when to move on, right? So, okay, hey, it's time to go. It's time to make a call. I know enough and about what I need to know. It's not black or white, is it? That's gray. It may be that we're not really 100% sure. And so again, we can be like Damasio's patient and continue to churn and go through all of the different angles and then miss the boat, right? Miss the opportunity. Number 5, the 5th and final, the who and the how. So once we come up with some analysis, there's an intuitive sense in which we know who needs to hear it, right? So, and not also that, but once we know who they are, who the audience, people, or person is that needs to hear our findings, we need to know how to get through to them, right? How to get through to them. So the who and the how. So I love this story about this. Before I go on, Laura says for number 3, back at number 3, sometimes our intuition takes us off on a tangent as we may mistakenly put importance on an anomaly or incorrectly interpret data. Yeah, that jumping off point where we kind of go down a next angle of analysis. And you might say, well, that might be a wild goose chase, right? I may have had this intuition that I need to go look at, I don't know, some proportion or some rate, and it was just useless, right? So that's just like the garden hose scenario, right? We might have an intuition that a next layer of analysis would be valuable, and we may be right or wrong. It might be a hose, it might be a snake, right? So how do we know about that up front? That's a great question. I think that's the question here. Where is the balance? How do you determine how many times you cycle through? I think the how many times one was addressed a little bit in number 4, which is knowing when to make the next move and go for it. But I don't think it really addresses your first part of your question, which is how do I know whether or not a given intuition about a different layer of analysis is going to be fruitful or not? I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, because oftentimes you need to do the analysis to know whether or not it was valuable or not. So that's a tough one. I think all I can say is the more you work with data, the more you start to see similar patterns of analysis that are able to give you a valuable second or third perspective. And so you may become maybe like fine-tuning or honing your intuition about a kind of next step that would or has often or to your way of thinking, might just provide value, versus when you're early on in the process, that you haven't really developed that sixth sense yet, as Alberto calls it. Great question, though. Yeah, all of this is very fuzzy and in that sense, I think fun and fascinating. But this came from actually a book right here that I recommend you check out. It's called The Quick and Easy, as if it's quick and easy, The Quick and Easy Way to Effective Speaking. Such a promising title, isn't it? By Dale Carnegie. We all know Dale Carnegie. Didn't you write that book everybody's read called How to Win Friends and Influence People or something like that? It's also a really good one about how to, deliver a presentation in a way that's engaging to people. Recommend you check it out. But in this one, relative to our fifth point about knowing who to talk to and how to get through to them. So he gives a story of Russell Conwell, who was the founder of Temple University. I think he was a minister. I don't know much else about him, but supposedly he gave a very famous talk called Acres of Diamonds. Has anybody ever heard of it or listened to it? I haven't. I'd like to now go find it. But he gave it upwards of 6,000 times, supposedly, all around, many, many times. So, in the story, the recounting of this individual, Mr. Conwell, he quotes him as saying, when he delivers a talk, before he's going to deliver the talk, he says, I visit a city or town. I try to arrive there early enough to see the postmaster, the barber, the hotel manager, the principal of the schools, some of the ministers. Then I go into the stores and talk with the people. I see what has been their history and what opportunities they had. Then I give my lecture and talk to those people about the subjects that apply to them locally. And that's fact-finding, that's information, that's getting a feel for an area and the people in it. But also it's kind of triggering his intuition about what is going to be interesting and informative to this group of people. What is going to connect with them? Knowing a little bit about what I can tell about them and what they care about. There's an intuition about how to frame even a message you've given 6,000 times before in a way that's new, unique, highly likely to land with that audience. So we know that, when we come to make a data presentation, right, and where is this in the overall flow here, right? That's right here in the top right corner. So part of the process of maturing from data that we've used and come to understanding about our environment is to actually tell someone else about it or another group of people by crafting a notable message. Again, it's in the adjective, notable. The adjective is notable. How do we know if it's notable to that particular audience? Well, there's an intuitive aspect to that. Knowing that, this is a message that's really going to be important to them. This is a way I can say it to them that's going to land and actually make a difference. And that's part of being data literate, isn't it? It's, in fact, you know what? I've been doing a little bit of outreach in a simple survey. I've had a few dozen people reply to it already, and 70 or some odd. And the question I'm asking is, what's your single biggest challenge with data literacy in your current environment? And the number one answer has something to do with effective presentation to coworkers, data storytelling. That's the number one in terms of like the way I would categorize the responses. There's lots of different ones, by the way, but that's the one that I've seen the most, the highest number of people responded. Their biggest single challenge with data literacy is knowing how to present it to another group of people in a way that is effective and lands. And again, that's intuition. We can get good at it and we can treat it like a science to study, to read about, storytelling with data. I've referred to that book before too. So crafting a notable message, this is so important. And it's highly intuitive. It's something that we have a sense for what's going to work well. The more we know the people, the more we know about them, the more we get to know them, what makes them tick, the more likely we are to say something interesting to them. If all we do is talk about what's interesting to us, they're not in it. They're not part of that equation. So I don't think, in that sense, we'd miss the boat. We would go all the way. It's like having the ball on the 1 yard line, which is all too familiar for people here in the Seattle area. And, then fumbling, throwing an interception, not getting it into the goal, into the end zone, because we missed that last step of not spending the time to ask ourselves, what does my intuition tell me is going to be a powerful message, a notable message for this particular group of people? Okay, so there we have it. Those are 5 ways I feel that human intuition is highly important in analytics, right? Knowing why any of this matters in the first place, there's an intuitive component to that. And that's why we hire people that have experience. That's why we look for, when, you're talking about VC and investing, they love to hear that someone started up and sold or ran a successful business before, right? Because they're going to have an intuitive sense based on their experience of what's important, what matters, as opposed to the person going through it the first time, who's still kind of feeling that out. May not know why something might matter or not, right? That's the first one. Number 2, knowing what the data is telling us and not telling us. We can't even visualize data without using the intuitive part of our brain, right? And also then knowing maybe what we might be fooled to be thinking the data is telling us when it's really not. Knowing where to look next, right? This whole idea that we go down another path now. Maybe it's a dead end. Maybe it's a rabbit hole, right? Or maybe it's the key to unlocking some important understanding. So the more we work with data, the more we have this intuition about where to look next. And then, like that chess example, when to stop. Okay, hey, we can keep doing this all day long. We can look at this a million different ways. We've got to make a call. We've got to go now. When are we there, right? When are we at that point where it's like, it's time to make the decision and make the move? You have an intuition about that, and so that's important. And then lastly, the who side of it, right? The who and the how. So how are we going to get our message across? Who cares? Who matters? Have you ever had the experience of having some amazing finding, and then you went and told someone about it and presented to them, and at the end of it, they just shrugged and said, this isn't really something I can do anything about. Maybe this is someone else's budget. Maybe this is the time is over for us to make that kind of a call, right? And I don't have that power organizationally. Who knows, right? So knowing who it is that we need to get to and sensing within the environment we're in, who are the decision makers we need to get in front of. And then once we do, well, let's not botch it. Once you get all the way to the point of getting in front of that key decision maker, great. What are you going to say to that person that makes a difference? All right. So in other words, I feel like if we just kind of like to take a step back and show, where those 5 different components were found, it's sort of really throughout. And that's, I think, the key takeaway that I want you to walk away with is that human intuition is used throughout the analytics process, throughout the decision-making process. It isn't something we just may use or may not use. It isn't something that if we do use, it's just in one place. It's really, part and parcel to this entire activity that we go through when we try to understand our environment. So I love the whole quote. I mentioned Clive Humby in his quote at the beginning. If we read the entire quote, he says, data is the new oil, right? We saw that already. But if you go on, what else does he say? Well, he says it's valuable, but if unrefined, it cannot really be used. It has to be changed into glass, plastic, chemicals, etc., to create a valuable entity that drives profitable activity. So must data be broken down, analyzed for it to have value. And again, as we've seen, a key part of that process of converting it into useful form involves human intuition. Okay, so Kasparov, it's a quick little poorly formatted slide here. Kasparov provided a word of warning relative to intuition, indicating that his intention was not to encourage you to blindly follow your gut instinct. If that's what you think I'm telling you in this presentation, please do not be mistaken. It isn't saying, oh, Ben said intuition matters, so I'm just going to follow my gut in every situation. No, he doesn't want you to rely, nor do I, to rely indiscriminately on simple first impressions. He goes on to admit that at times your instincts will point in one direction. That direction is a dead end, right? That's fair. That's true. That happens. There is some recent research that I'd like to refer to. It's so recent, it was like last week it came out. Not this book, but it was by this researcher, Daniel Kahneman. Maybe you've heard of him. He's an Israeli psychologist and behavioral economist. A lot of his work with his late partner, Amos Tversky, has become popularly available, including, I would highly recommend Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman. Won the Nobel Prize in economics for some of his work. And so he's the one actually who's done a lot of work into these biases and heuristics, understanding the tricks our minds play on us. But he just literally March 4th last week wrote an article with a couple co-authors, Dan Lavallo and Olivier Sivigny, in MIT Sloan Management Review called A Structured Approach to Strategic Decisions. Now they've developed a process called MEAP, M-A-P. You've got to read this article. It's fascinating. What MEAP is all about, mediating assessments protocol. It's kind of a wonky title. Mediating assessments. That means when we're going to make a decision, it's all about decision making. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is define the assessments up front. In other words, let's say we are going to make a decision on where to put a manufacturing plant. Okay, well, what matters? What are the factors that matter, right? Maybe the geopolitical stability, maybe the availability of certain skilled workforce, maybe the tax rate, right? There's a handful of factors we would want to say as a team, these aspects are important. Those become our mediating assessments. We're going to assess those factors, and those are going to mediate. Those are the things that are going to help us decide. And there's a protocol to follow. So the first thing we do, we define ahead of time what those assessments are. Then we go about using fact-based, independently made assessments. We try not to let our assessment of one thing affect the assessment of a totally separate factor. And then we make the final evaluation when all of these assessments are complete. And they also recommend using percentiles as a rating scale. For example, is the geopolitical stability of this country, say Colombia, where we want to put this factory, is it in the top 10%, of stability in terms of all the other alternatives we have here? Is it maybe in the lower, maybe quartiles? It could be simple enough. Is it, in the top 25 most stable? Is it the next 25? Is it in the bottom 25 in terms of stability, right? So those are our median assessments, and we try to place them in there, right? So decision making, this is, again, very practical. This isn't theoretical. This isn't just, oh, let's use intuition. What they're saying is, you really need to identify what those assessments are up front, and then you need to go through a very diligent process, as much time as you feel you have at your team's disposal, of coming up with an assessment for each one of those. Go through them and then make the call. So at the end of this article, what they say is some decision makers will have an initial dislike for MEAP, just as many recruiters. They talk about it being very similar to recruiting to hire someone, right? So a lot of times it's an unstructured process. We get in a room and we just chat, and I just kind of go on to the next person, or they just sort of have random questions for you, and we all get together at the end and say kind of what we liked and disliked. Or is it a more structured thing where I'm saying, well, what's really important is this candidate is able to communicate and present, and they need to be able to do the following things well. And so then each person is sort of, required to assess them on a different factor. So some decision makers these requirements may appear mechanical, and the limits it places on the role of intuition. It does limit intuition, right? And it's not just saying, oh, just talk with a candidate and go with your gut, or just take a look at these different potential sites and someone just kind of make a call who's done this kind of a thing before, right? That's trusting the gut. That's a little bit risky. So they talk about these structured decision-making initiatives. And if you read the article, you'll know as much about it as I do. Again, it's a week old, and all I was able to find was the article itself, as well as some news stories talking about it. But what they say at the very end of it is, unlike algorithmic decision-making, which aims to take subjectivity out of the decision entirely, MEAP values intuition provided that it is informed. The holistic judgment of experienced executives is valuable, but it must first be prepared by a profile of mediating assessments. And this is what I love about this approach. Very similar to the recommendation I made in my MBA research, which is that we need to combine analytics and intuition. And this is not such a new idea, actually. In fact, it's about as old as can possibly be. So, and that's, again, my reaction to that, going back to the ad, is that, as I tweeted back a few years ago, we should look at intuition and analytics as complementing each other, not replacing each other. And again, this is not a new idea. This is actually going way back. If you read Plato's Phaedrus, which is one of the discourses of Plato, right? We're talking about ancient Greek philosophy here. He, in the discussion with Phaedrus, talks about human decision-making and the human soul, as being the combination of like a chariot and a charioteer, right? The charioteer and the reins, that's the intellect or the reason. And then we have a couple horses here, right? One is moral impulse, things we want to do that's noble, that's good. And then we have this other horse that is attached to us and our organizations thereby, which is irrational passion, excuse me, the desires to maybe, more on the negative side of things, right? Greed, things like that. But ultimately, what we are is a combination of those things. This is not new. In fact, it even goes beyond or prior to Plato. If you're familiar with any of the Hindu texts, ancient Sanskrit texts, this is from the Katha Upanishad, which is, again, from Hindu writings. So they have the exact same analogy, right? The self as lord of the chariot, the body is the chariot itself, the discriminating intellect is a charioteer, the mind is the reins, the senses, say the wives or the horses, right? So this exact same analogy is going back millennia, that we have these combinations of resources at our disposal, and they each have their valuable contribution to the decision-making process. Data, intellect, reason, couple that with desire to accomplish great things, noble things, and even our own profit motives that are baked into the equation there. Those are all things that cause us to go in certain directions. And again, it isn't like we give free rein to any one of those. They need to be working in harmony. They need to be working together in concert with each other. And in that sense, this is exactly what MEAP is all about. That's exactly what I would like, the core point I would like to make in this webinar, that don't just think of data-driven decision-making or decisioning, as some people call it, as this need to replace your gut or intuition with somehow some foolproof intellectual exercise. It's just not that way. That's not true. That's not how it really is. That's selling the value of data. And it's also, frankly, underselling the value of your own intuition or gut. Okay, so I would like to there stop and say that's what I have. And I've got a few minutes left. So and I'll send out links to the resources that I talked about here. We mentioned a number of books, sites, articles that I think kind of come together to hopefully give a compelling argument that you should be thinking about intuition as something highly valuable. But what comments or questions do you have? What thoughts do you have about this topic in general? What questions maybe do you have for me about analytics and intuition and how I see that as relating to literacy? Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. So there's actually an audio recording of Acres by Diamonds. Great. I can't wait to listen to that. Again, I don't even know what the topic is about, so I'm really interested to hear what that presentation is all about now, just based on what Carnegie says about the presenter. So thank you very much for that. Any other, what else would you guys like to add to the conversation here? Lori's mentioning the new Kahneman article is geared to strategic decisions. Yeah, but they also talk about how it can be geared to repetitive decisions. Like, say, for example, the scenario that they bring up in the article about a VC investment firm that makes decisions over and over and over again about which companies to invest in versus which companies not to invest in. Still probably strategic, but not just necessarily a one-off or ad hoc. It can also be something that occurs multiple times and over again. Yeah, but thank you for that, for clarifying about that. That's definitely true. And it's like leadership making decisions within organizations. I think a lot of the times what people mean when they understand data-driven decisions or requiring executives to, consider how they make decisions and such. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining in. I hope you found this valuable. Again, let's kind of value intuition, also be alert to it. Oh, one more comment here from Bonnie. I'd like to discuss the inquiry of Byron Katie and cognitive restructuring. I've never heard of that, so I'll make a note of that. The inquiry of Byron Katie and cognitive restructuring. A thought is harmless until we believe it. Quote, it is not our thoughts, but our attachment to our thoughts that cause suffering. Well, that's going down a whole different avenue of thought there, which I love. This whole idea of kind of stoicism, or the ability to sort of understand that our reaction to the world is our opinion about things and how those things happen to us and in our situations. So, yeah, great point. Wendy says, do stakeholders have a responsibility to improve on their data literacy skills in order to give more merit to their intuition? Yes, I do think so. I believe that the more we use data in decision-making context, we hone that skill or ability. In other words, we get better and better at knowing how to combine these things in tandem to be able to make great decisions. So I think we do have a responsibility to improve. I think data literacy itself is something that is part of that equation. To give more merit to their intuition, that's interesting. So in other words, your intuition is more valuable if you have data. Well, I think that data, if you have an intuition and you have data to back it up, I think you're more likely to be heard. But also there's the factor, as we all know, just the loudest voice in the room sometimes can be another effective way to be heard. So it isn't always just whether or not we're heard, because there's good ways to go about that and maybe less good ways to go about that. But certainly I do think if you have an intuition and you check that intuition with data and the data confirms it, I think that certainly makes it a very compelling combination to communicate to our stakeholders and team members. So yeah, I do think that they're related. Excuse me. Hanging in there. Okay, so Alexi says, how do you change someone else's mind when you hear? I am more of a science-y person, don't really believe in intuition or visualization. Oh, that's a great question. So in other words, what do I say about the person who says, I think that everything I've presented up until now. So I guess one way I would do it is give a webinar on the topic. They may not hear it, and they may not be the person who's likely to log in and listen to it due to the confirmation bias, in which they're less likely to hear information that they don't already agree with. But yeah, how do we take a person out there who says, it's all about the data, show me the data. I don't want to hear about your gut or your instinct or your intuition. I think it's turning around on them maybe a little bit and asking them questions and then helping them understand that their answers to that involve an intuitive component as well. That might be annoying or lectury though, so it highly probably depends on the relationship you've got with that person. I don't know if there's a simple easy magic bullet there to convince everybody that intuition is valuable. So I'll just, I guess, maybe say that's something I think, we have to kind of take case by case. Robert says, a fascinating subject, although in my experience in large enterprises, intuition can also hold a very unproductive meaning. What's your view? Yeah, that's exactly at the beginning of the presentation. I tried to give a sense of why that's the case. People not trusting intuition and sort of seeing it as something that is not productive. And I think oftentimes because it's taken in lieu of data. In other words, it's seen as something that happens without data, which is the idea I've tried to rectify in this presentation, that it isn't just that intuition is something that occurs when there's no data, right? But rather, it's something that's part of the decision-making process when data is included. So that's my view, that, yeah, I can see how intuition all by itself might be unproductive. I think sometimes, though, let me give a silly example, but I used to grow up playing soccer. So let's say we got a whole game plan with my coach, and the coach, I'm a soccer player in the team. My coach is going to talk about how we're going to move the ball from side to side or what have you in the course of our strategy for the game. But then, during the course of the game, for some reason, the goalie falls over because someone trips him. So I would then abandon the strategy and kick the ball into the net, right? So it's a moment where I have a split-second reaction. I need to do something now. My intuition tells me kick the ball into the net, and I do. I don't refer back to the strategy. I don't look at any game plans or, stats about whether or not this team is susceptible to that kind of, right? It's just like, well, so in that sense, intuition in those split-second decision moments where there's no time for data, or there is no data, or the data is so costly to get that we have no ability to make a decision with it for one reason or another, right? In that case, that's all you've got. In that sense, yeah, it might backfire. You might make the wrong decision, and you might make the right one. I'm not saying that just because you go with intuition, you make the right call and it works out great. But you might not have the luxury of doing anything other than that. Last comment here, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah, Blink. So Laura mentions Blink. Malcolm Gladwell, his book where he talks about how our gut can be dead on, and while we can't support it with data, it can be as valid. Would you agree with this? The idea that data experience grows our intuition's ability. Yeah, that's just like the example I was talking about with the soccer player. I think I read the book many years ago, but I believe he talks about the idea of, and it's actually kind of a charged topic now, but a law enforcement officer sort of intuiting whether or not the suspect has a gun or not. And, it's something that they just kind of like feel in a flash of a moment of time. And, it wouldn't really be something necessarily like that data would help them with. And again, I think that there are those examples and cases where intuition doesn't just inform the way we work with data. It might be something that actually, is better in certain instances. Like, again, the case of the garden hose I talked about. Again, it's an illustrative example, but I actually would like to jump into a bush away from the coiled object before I actually get further information about whether or not it's a stake, because going the next step of getting that information might actually cost me my life, right? So there are some cases where, yeah, and I think Gladwell mentioned some of those. And again, those are oftentimes the realm of the highly experienced individual, right? Like a baseball player swinging a bat. Is this a curveball? Is this a fastball? How should I swing? Where should I swing? Should I put the bat on my shoulder? That happens in a split-second moment of time. And there's a lot of processing going on there in the brain, using these different components of the brain, the amygdala, the frontal lobe, the visual cortex, etc. And it's producing a decision like so quickly that the person can't even really like dissect or parse out the different elements of it. So I think in those cases, yeah, I think it's less likely in business. Well, I don't know about that. I'm not sure if I'd go so far as say it's less likely. I just think that in business, oftentimes we are asking ourselves, what's the data we can bring to bear to this decision? And it isn't like jumping from a cheetah in the savannah. We do have a moment to at least, a day or a few days or a week to talk about, kind of crunching some numbers to add it to our instinct or intuition. So in that sense, I believe in business, data is super valuable and useful. I just think that oftentimes, there's sometimes where intuition's all you've got for one reason or another. But even when you do have data, you're looking at applying intuition in ways you maybe not even really appreciating, which is what I tried to bring about an understanding of in this talk, at least the way I see it. Thanks, everyone. We're at the top of the hour, a little past, in fact, so I'll let y'all go. But really love this talk, and thank you for your interaction. Thanks for the comments and the questions, and for spending the time with me. So take a look. I will send out the link to the recording. If you think there's someone out there who maybe needs to appreciate intuition a little more than they have, then feel free to send that along to anyone in your network. And we'll wrap it up there. So everyone take care. Bye. And until next week, 2 weeks from now, we'll jump on the next webinar. Look for the announcement to come out about that real soon. Okay.